Hi everyone, welcome back to part 2 of spending and services. So we will continue with the politics of public education. To start off with, we will talk about the State Board of Education, the SBOE. As I have discussed before, the SBOE has a very important role in Texas education, and with the continuing slides, we will see just how important this role is. Now, when it comes to curriculum decisions and textbooks, this is one of the SBOE's most important roles when it comes to public education, is deciding what education should actually be. The curriculum in the state of Texas is determined by the State Board of Education. Now, the State Board of Education is also responsible for deciding which textbooks will be used in the classroom. The SBOE can be a hindrance to education, though. In 2010, the SBOE created an uproar when it mandated the teaching of conservative values and beliefs and a conservative view of history, including downplaying the role of slavery in the Civil War, the positive influence of Joseph McCarthy, the senator who instigated the Red Scare during the 1950s, which is known as McCarthyism, also the Judeo-Christian influence on the Founding Fathers, and that separation of church and state are not in the American Constitution, which we know they are. Note that the SBOE's decisions are affecting what all public school students learn in the state of Texas. Now, the SBOE has the power to dictate what textbooks are being used. The SBOE provides a list of textbooks that the state may buy for public school courses. The selection process leads to intense battles between liberal and conservative groups. The State Board of Education pressures publishers to tailor textbooks to conform to the values and beliefs of its board members. Think of the far-reaching implications to over 5 million students in the state. Remember, publishers' ultimate goal is to sell books and make a profit. These decisions all lead to the next two issues that we will cover. Culture wars. When we talk of culture wars, we have to talk about standardized tests. And we have been taking standardized tests in the state of Texas since the 1980s. Of course, the names have changed, but the goal is still the same, right? We've known about TAS, TAX, STAR, EOC. It is all still the same thing. These lead to culture wars because there are claims of bias when it comes to standardized exams. How can a standardized test be considered bias? Remember, these tests are supposed to measure all students' knowledge that is supposed to be fairly standardized across the state. Student performance has increased, and the gap in performance between ethnic groups has narrowed. If there is or was bias in the standardized exams, it seems to be working its way out of the exams. Now, when it comes to faculties and students, the SBOE certification establishes standards for teachers. Remember that whole no pass, no teach thing. But hiring of teachers is left to local school districts. Salaries for Texas teachers remain below the national average. The number of students in Texas schools, though, is increasing. In 2017-2018 school year, the statewide enrollment increased from the previous year by 0.8%, but over the last 10-year period, the total enrollment increased by 15.6%, or 728,000 students. Further, the student body is becoming increasingly diverse. Across the five largest racial ethnic groups in 2017-2018, enrollment increased from the previous year for African Americans, Asians, Hispanics, and multiracial students, and decreased slightly for white students. Across the same groups, Hispanic students accounted for the largest percentage of total enrollment in Texas public schools in 2017-2018 at just over 52%, followed by white students at 27.9%, African Americans at 12.6%, Asians at 4.4%, and multiracial students at 2.3%. Funding, though, is still scarce, and there is always school finance reform to consider. In the 2017-2018 budgeted financial data, it shows that expenditures, so how much we are spending for public schools, were at $10,532 per student. Remember, public school funding comes from three sources: federal, state, and local taxes, and the distribution of this money is governed by a complex set of rules. Federal grants is part of that money, and those have increased in recent years. The Permanent School Fund provides funding from revenue provided by public lands, and 1/4 of the motor fuels tax goes to the Available School Fund, which is in charge of textbooks. Now remember, 1/4 of the motor fuel tax goes to textbooks, goes to education through the Available School Fund. Think back to the lecture on the previous subject on taxing and budgeting. I believe it was there where I mentioned where the other 3/4 of the motor fuel tax is allocated. So be sure you know where the motor fuel tax is allocated. Now, the Foundation School Program provides the largest segment of funding from the general funds. Local funding comes from ad valorem taxes and property taxes. Texas ranks 36th nationally in spending per student. 36th. That means there are 35 states ahead of us that spend more on a per student basis than Texas does. When it comes to local funding is based on property taxes, and it varies so greatly that the state has been forced to impose recapture requirements, and richer districts in some cases must share their revenue with poorer districts. This is known as the Robin Hood Plan. Now, this Robin Hood Plan came about because of a court case called Edgewood versus Kirby. Now, Edgewood versus Kirby led the state to a convoluted and complicated plan to better equalize state funding of public schools. Revenues now depend primarily on the local tax rate because the state guarantees that local property taxes will produce a certain amount of revenue, or the state will make up the difference. Despite these changes, though, there is still great disparity in funding among school districts. Now, among recent proposals for school finance reform are various voucher programs where public funds could be used to enable students to attend private or parochial schools. If the school is a failing school, the parents would have the ability to move their children to a higher performing school, meaning a private or other public school or a charter school. However, there are issues, and some of these issues with these voucher programs is that it becomes expensive for the state. There could also be testing in the cases of magnet or vanguard schools, or even some charter schools. And of course, there is always the prestige factor that some of these schools have, and thus they end up charging more on a per student basis. Now, when it comes to higher education, meaning you guys, colleges and universities, these are coordinated by the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board, the THECB, basically the CB. Higher education in public institutions, meaning state schools, is governed to some extent by the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board. Higher education in Texas was not established systematically, so the coordinating board has difficulty imposing a rational, coherent system upon the operations of colleges and universities. Higher education, though, is a major state service, accounting for 9.5% of the state's costs in the 2018-19 budget. Of course, each college and university has its own board of regents and trustees. Now, each board sets policies for their own institution within the guidelines established by the coordinating board. Community colleges are also governed by the coordinating board and locally elected board of regents. Higher education has proven to correlate with higher income, yet the call for greater faculty and student accountability continues. Legislative bodies and boards of regents and trustees continue their critical evaluation of higher education and its results. Of course, you cannot have higher education, whether it be community college, junior college, technical college, or universities, without student enrollment. And the data describe characteristics of the Texas population when it comes to student enrollment. This includes racial and ethnic distribution by age. Now, statewide higher education enrollment data shown by race, ethnicity, and gender will illustrate how changing demographics are reflected in the state's public and private post-secondary institutions. Dual credit enrollment is shown to highlight the significant growth Texas has experienced in this area over the past 10 years. Most of this increase in enrollment has occurred in two-year institutions. Now, as you can see from this chart that is based on higher education and is provided by the Higher Education Coordinating Board, you can see the breakdown between race and ethnicity, those that are economically disadvantaged, enrollment by gender, enrollment that is dual credit at the two-year and public university, and just statewide enrollment at two-year and four-year institutions. So as you can see from the numbers that are shown here, we are talking about the breakdown as of, this was during the fall of 2017, and just look at what the enrollment was of students in the fall of 2017. It was 1.6 million students. So this is for your information. It is an infographic so you can see how the numbers break down. It is not something that is going to be tested on, but just be aware that this is the information that's out there. And the same thing with this chart. If you will see, this is just a breakdown of the number of actual institutions within the state. It is for your information and not necessarily because it is going to be tested on, but you can see that there are multiple campuses across multiple universities all over the state. Now, when it comes to continuing with higher education, these are just some of the public education systems that are within the state of Texas. Of course, the most well-known are UT and A&M. There is, of course, Texas State, the University of Houston, Texas Tech. Those are all multi-campus services, multi-campus institutions with services across the state and their main locations. Of course, we also have single campus institutions such as Texas Southern University in Houston, Lamar University, Stephen F. Austin, Tarleton, Prairie View A&M. These are universities also within the Texas State University system, but these are universities that have one main campus and not multiple locations. A lot of the universities, though, are expanding, so of course this can always change from year to year. Another infographic so that you can see this, of course, is just a comparison of public versus private and community colleges versus universities. Again, not anything that you need to know on test day, but so that you can see these are just some of the numbers that are out there for the difference in public, private, and community colleges and universities. Now, of course, when it comes to continuing with the politics of higher education, we see that there are always financial issues that we need to speak of. We see these problems with financing higher education. Every year, college and university tuition becomes more expensive. In the early 2000s, the state legislature in Texas stopped funding higher education at the same levels that it had been. So the legislature basically told colleges and universities to increase tuition to make up for the shortfall. So the price of attending has skyrocketed in the last 20 years. What we are doing is pricing out poor and low and middle income students. There are always faculty issues to deal with also. As I have mentioned, faculty salaries in the state of Texas are well below the national average, and faculty is subject to evaluations. This, of course, leads to retention difficulties. What we are seeing is that instructors are leaving the teaching field for the private sector due to higher salaries they would earn in the private sector. So you have good professors that are leaving, and thus the students suffer as they lose quality instructors. Then there is the issue of diversity. Okay, so when it comes to diversity, this is not just meaning meeting or working with different cultures. Diversity here is helping you look at issues in a different manner and show you other sides of issues. So there is, of course, this thinking that once you're in college or university, you are opening and expanding your mind. So we are not talking about diversity in the sense of we're different people. We are, of course, but because of diversity, you are now exposed to different viewpoints, and that is what we are talking about, is these viewpoints that come into play when we talk about the politics of higher education. Now, when it comes to quality, is the quality of higher education in Texas bad? No. On the contrary, it is not bad. We always have A&M and UT rank in the highest percentiles of good universities in the United States. There is every year a ranking of U.S. News that has the best states and higher education rankings, and A&M is usually in the top 25 universities. And UT will consistently rank in the top 50. So when you stop and consider how many universities there are across the country, being in the top 25 or even the top 50 is not a bad thing. So just be aware that while there are issues with higher education in Texas, it is not a bad educational system. There are still good universities in the state. Okay, I will stop here and let y'all catch y'all's breath. I will finish up spending and services in the next part 3 in the next video lecture, so be sure you look out for that. Until then, y'all have a good one.